sake. So welcome to the 8th annual Hugh H. Iltis Lecture in Plant Systematics and Natural History, which honors the tireless dedication and commitment to local, national, and international systematics offered by our friend and colleague, Professor Hugh Iltis, who served as director of the herbarium at the UW-Madison for nearly 40 years, from 1955 to 1993. Of course, many of you know that Professor Iltis passed away last December. He attended all of these, the past 7 of these lectures. He usually sat right here, so I'm a little emotional thinking about this right now. I brought his portrait that hangs in the herbarium so that he could be with us today in spirit. There is no doubt that Dr. Iltis earned his place in history as an equal to such Wisconsin botanical luminaries as Lapham, Cheney, Curtis, Davis, and Fassett, among others. To commemorate his accomplishments, Hugh's portrait now hangs alongside these other great men within the state herbarium. Like other disciplines in the biological sciences, the field of plant systematics has undergone a revolution over the past few decades, thanks primarily to the adoption of molecular techniques and powerful methods of computing and bioinformatics. But systematists have always recognized that these techniques and methods are only examples of a few tools from the much larger systematist's toolkit. And we must not lose sight of the fact that the foundation of diversity studies has been and always will be direct observation of plants living in the field and preserved in museum collections. For this reason, the State Herbarium since 2010 has sponsored an invited colloquium speaker whose research epitomizes the use of the broad and ever-expanding systematist's toolkit. So, as a reminder, we will have our local field excursion together on Saturday so that we may all share together and enjoy an exciting botanical exploration. This year's excursion will be to Pine Hollow State Natural Area in Sauk County. We'll rendezvous there at 10 a.m. I've got a few extra maps if you need one of them. Okay, so without further ado, this year's invited speaker is Professor Emmet Judziewicz. I know you've heard that a million different forms, right? And we're really happy to have him. Emmet recently retired from the UW-Stevens Point and is spending quite a bit of time in Hawaii. In fact, more and more, but he still has his home in central Wisconsin. And if you understand something about his career path and trajectory, you'll understand why he deserves a much, he certainly has earned his retirement and break. Emmet's been a busy guy. Number one, I just did a search in the online WisFlora portal, and although all of our statewide specimens are not yet database, he has over 1,500 collections in that database already different. So there's probably more. I'm sure you're way up above that number. But Emmet, do you know the number? Emmet earned his Bachelor's of Science degree in Geography from UW Parkside, and then went on to do a Master's and a PhD here at UW-Madison. So he's one of our alums. Now, in particular, his PhD was under the supervision of Professor Iltis, so it's especially fitting that he is our speaker this year. That was in 1987, and it was on the taxonomy of the tribe Farinae in the Poaceae, so it's a primitive lineage of grasses. And he's continued to work not only on best bamboos and grasses, in addition to floristic studies. Then Emmet went on to work at the Smithsonian on and off for several years during the 1980s. He then came back to Wisconsin and did quite a lot of survey work, especially up in the Apostle Islands and throughout the state. He worked closely with Jim Bennett during that time. And he eventually was hired by the Wisconsin DNR from 1995 to 2001, so continued to explore and collect around the state of Wisconsin, and ultimately was hired onto the faculty at UW-Stevens Point in 2001. As I mentioned, he retired 2 years ago, but he's continued to teach classes and be engaged in the statewide activities there. Maybe your last class?
Last
Getting close. Also, many of you probably know Emmet from his publications, in particular Wildflowers of Wisconsin and the Great Lakes region.
And Merrill Black did most of that work.
Yeah. Together with Merrill. It's in its 2nd edition. He was telling me that the first edition is now becoming a highly rare collection. And that it was recently featured on, what's it, A Books for like, some astronomical press. So, and then more recently, he authored a book on Wisconsin, a field guide to Wisconsin grasses. He's working on a couple of others as well. I think he has a few copies available for sale.
Like 20% off what you see on Amazon if you want a copy.
So if you're interested, please talk to him. Okay, so without further ado, let's give a round of applause and welcome.
Well, thank you, Ken, and I'm pleased to be back here. Somewhat sad that Lucas couldn't have joined us today. I know he was at the talk last year. And so I've got a lot of slides to show you. I want to jump right in. And if you look, I've drawn on the board here the places I'm going to talk about today. I'm primarily going to talk about my property in northeastern Wisconsin. I call it Butternut Pines. And I've been surveying plants there for 42 years systematically, since I was your age, students in here. And I'm talking about my brother's property up in Bayfield County, Calcamo spruces, which I surveyed 25 years ago. And also on my property, Butternut Pines, I'm also going to talk about succession in a Scotch pine plantation over the last 36 years. And that has a Madison connection too, because I actually did a paper on that for Grant Cottom's Vegetation of Wisconsin class in the summer of 1981. And I think I have actually, you'll actually see some data from that survey 36 years ago. So, and I guess the point is to see how the floras have changed. I mean, some of you I'm sure are ecologists in here, and you're used to using quadrat square meter, or maybe a 100 square meter, or 10,000 square meter plot. We're talking about plots here that are 20 acres and 40 acres, and I've walked over nearly every square meter of it, sometimes several times. So these are giant sampling plots, and you'll see how the flora has changed in 20, 24, and 42 years respectively. Think about how much change you might expect in those time periods in the flora. So here's a shot from Oconto County, Butternut Pines, taken 36 years apart. I've got a more recent shot too I took last week. You'll see that later on. And that's my brother in the river back in '64.
And we might put the arrows on the laptop.
Yeah.
On the laptop.
Doesn't work?
On the laptop, yeah.
All right. I see. All right. So I'd like to dedicate this to my mentor, Hugh. Iltis. This is a quote that I remember very well from plant geography. And these are some of the charismatic plants that we found at Butternut Pines over the years. I'd like to also acknowledge Don Zaborski in the audience too, who's joined me the last 2 summers to try to get a more complete coverage, to make sure I haven't missed anything in my old age, going back and looking for these plants once again, 40 years later. So some of the cool plants you find here are cardinal flower, green dragon, which I found for the first time this summer, a southern species that apparently is moving in there. Bottle gentian, bug on a stick. Anyone into bryophytes? Bug on a stick. Very rare moss, really cool thing. And then this one I think is the most interesting one, Indian cucumber root, Mediola, which is quite uncommon northeastern Wisconsin. It's affected by deer browsing. I believe this patch, John, that we found, I had to talk to Kevin Noll, it may be the largest one in the state, as far as I know. Can't change it. All right, that's me. Before I get into botany. I got sick of school, I thought it was useless. So I saved up some money, got a Volkswagen convertible, and did a $13,000 gap semester in the fall of '74 going around clockwise. And at that point, I didn't know any plants at all. When I got back, I still didn't know any plants, but I was interested. All the plant communities in the deserts, the redwood forest. I thought, I'm going to learn these plants. And so I luckily had this wonderful property in northern Wisconsin, and I started learning first I learned the trees in the winter, then I learned the ferns in the spring, and then I learned the wildflowers in the summer, that first summer. But then by the end of this first summer, I got interested in grasses and sedges. They were challenging. And so I'd never been to a herbarium. I created my own using photographic albums from that era. So there's like a cellophane cover here, and I pasted these labels next to the grasses and sedges. And it still has this herbarium. It's going to be incorporated into the And I also did this. This is pre-computer now. I had a 3x5 card file. I made like 600 different cards printed up like this with a picture of the property. And I used a red felted pen to record every species and every location on the 40 acres. So for example, this orchid, Ken knows this one, I'm sure, green twig lake, Leptaris loeselii, found in 6 different places on the property in 1976. Can't find it now. Here's some more cards. These are some sedges. I also, if I collected them, put on the date and the number of the collection. And collections are very important. You can't just go by a site record, even a picture, because many species are being split based on DNA into other species, like Canada goldenrod, maybe several species. You've got to have a voucher. You can't just put a picture on iNaturalist and make that serve for 100 years. So these are my Bibles in 1976 when I got into botany. San County Almanac, I read that in high school. Vegetation of Wisconsin, big time. And Lost Flora, Michigan, since he had good keys to the grasses and sedges. It was a real effort to learn grasses and sedges, but very satisfying when you got over the learning curve. So these are objectives of this study. It's not really a hypothesis-driven study, it's natural history. Let's look at how diverse a tract of, let's say, 8 or 16 hectares is. How does the flora change? What plant groups are most affected? And why might these changes be occurring? So intensive floristic surveys, I think I've got over 1,150 collections in this herbarium, one in Stevens Point. And this is the location of these plots. Cowpimo spruces up here, and the Lake Superior clay plain, and butternut pines down here. First, I'm going to talk mostly about butternut pines because I still have so much material to show you. I'll mention Cowpimo spruces. The butternut pines right here, it's been on our family since 1954, and it has the O'Connell River running through it, and had some agricultural use in the past. You'll see some pictures in a second of air photos to show you how much was farmed back in the 1930s. The soils are well-drained loam, as opposed to heavy clay Cowpimo spruces. That makes a difference. And it's located right here, edge of the Canadian Shield here, edge of the Nicolay National Forest. And I just want to point out here, stochastic events can affect these plots. Here's a 2007 tornado swath, and this is my picture shortly after the tornado on Highway 64 showing how much was devastated. Imagine if that had gone through by chance butternut pines. And then here's a picture, relatively recent picture, air photo, showing the 40-acre butternut pines plot. You can see it's changed very much in my lifetime. I think when I was a boy in the 50s, I can still remember planting those pines with my father. I was 4 or 5 years old. There were only a handful of houses. Now I count 41 permanent plus seasonal dwellings in this shot, whereas there were only 4 in the 1938 air photo. Here's our cabin right here. The red rectangle is the pine plantation. So here's a 1938 air photo, the very first one, almost 80 years old. And you can see that the forest cover is perhaps about 20%, mainly along the river corridor. The rest were fields used to graze cows. I know from talking to neighbors that's what happened to them. Looks like they're trying to start an orchard here. You can see little dots are spaced here. This tree right here is the namesake of the property, the epidum. That's the old butternut tree right in here. I think it might be surrounded by sweet fern, but I've actually had children of the previous owners come in the 1970s and say, oh look, there's the butternut. It was like a landmark tree in the area back 80 years ago. And you will see its fate shortly. So apologize for this, but this is 1972. Here's the forest cover. You can see the Scotch pine plantation in here, more trees here, and then also, but just open fields yet in 1972, completely open. And then this strip here is an old river channel, the O'Connell River. River flows from west to east, so this is about 10 feet above the main river channel, but very diverse in terms of wetland plants. And then here's another shot before and after, 1964, and then just last week. You can see the difference. Here's the red pine 7 years old, and here they are 60 years old in this shot over here. I have these little picture, these little maps shows the direction of the view in this case. The red star indicates a very landmark old red oak tree. It's still there and quite large. It's evident in 64, and you can even see it in 1938. Okay, and then finally, a more recent shot just a few months ago on Google Earth. You can see it's nearly all treed in now. I consider it to be 95% forested. Just a few openings here, here, and here. And here's, based on air photos, here is the percent coverage, tree coverage of the property. 1855, it was originally a beech hemlock forest based on land survey records with scattered large white pines, mezquitas, no openings, and then 20% on that first air photo. And you notice when I first started surveying, it was like a golden moment, the sweet spot, when the increase of forest cover was almost an inflection point. I think that really, you'll see what later on, what the result is here. As I mentioned, beech was a dominant tree back in pre-settlement, 1930, pre-settlement times. Now there's just a few beech sprouts about 2 or 3 inches in diameter, very few. It's not a dominant tree at all on Butternut Pines. Here's a topo map I created of the property based on, I had little transit, surveyor's transit, I did this in '76. So you can see there is topography. There are very steep slopes facing north, that's where bug-out stick, hemlock, cedar occur, polypody fern. Steep south-facing slopes, which had a couple of prairie species. And then you had floodplain terraces, like right here, where silt was deposited, that are quite mesic and quite rich. So, and then you had this slough here, as I call it, which has bog plants like column. So an amazing assortment of plant. I think I counted like 12 or 15 Curtis plant communities here. Down in this area, it's very sandy, and there were quite a few prairie species at one time. So the nodes of plant diversity are correlated mostly with the wetlands. So along the river, seeps, there's a little fen here, mesic terraces, a bog, and then a little bit of a prairie element right in here. I should mention that when I first started surveying the area in the '75, '76, by that time, these fields had huge amounts of little bluestem in them and other prairie species. Not planted, no chance of that. Certainly they weren't present at the time of the general land survey in the 19th century. My guess is they got there either by the farmer introducing them inadvertently, or perhaps my father when he planted those pines. He got them from a nursery in Washera County in the central sand plain. I think he might have inadvertently brought prairie species in. Okay, I also did, Curtis really inspired me to go out there 40 years ago and measure every tree on the property. I measured 6,200 trees by the BBH tape. Here are the size classes, and I hadn't redone that. That's just but you can see the dominant trees by importance value were white pine 20, 20, white birch 17, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I want to show you the next slide highlights how things have changed. So white pine, white birch, red maple, red oak, they've increased in the last 40 years. Some have somewhat decreased, and then some have dropped out entirely. Big surprise, plant pathogens, elm, butternut, and then silver maple, which was interesting. So let's go into those 3 trees that have dropped out. American elms, they were common back in the mid-70s. Dutch elm disease knocked them out. There were a few dead trunks left in 1982 when I took these pictures, especially along the slough right here. And there, it's now gone as a tree, where our seedlings are. The butternut, here is a picture of it, 1938, 1994. That's the year after the last nut crop that I saw. The canker started attacking it in the late 90s. It died in 2007. Here's a 2010 shot, and the last dead trunk collapsed about 2 years ago. What's interesting about the butternuts, they've all died, but I still see seedlings coming up. I saw about 24 seedlings the last 2 years, even though any source tree with fruiting has been gone for 2 decades now. So I don't know anything about how long a butternut seed is viable in the soil. It must be quite a long time. And then this was a surprise. Here is these 3 trees that have gone away. See how many trees there were back in 1975 and 6. And then when I started this resurvey in 2 years ago rather, I thought, well, the silver maple's there. I couldn't find any. That's the invisible present, the vanishing present. It's dropped out without you even noticing it, even though it's in your backyard. You're a trained botanist. You don't notice when it goes away. So you can see there were 27 trees, at least 2 inches deviate to silver maple, gone now. So why might that be? Well, I think shade is one thing that's going to be, but I think another thing is the late effects of dam construction upstream. The dam was about 5 miles upstream, was constructed in 1937, regulated flooding, of course, so no more floods on that floodplain, and it probably took 60, 70, 80 years of lack of silt and a seed base for these silver maples to drop out after the ones that died. That's my theory anyway. So here is looking down the river to the west, upstream, in the winter. You get a sense of place here. And then here is 1964, just about the same view. Wood turtles, by the way, were common as a kid. You still see them every year on the tractor, fairly common still, thankfully. And then here are 3 different shots, basically from the same angle. So this is one I took just a week ago. You can see this birch here is this one right here, and I think this is the pine right here. So you can see there's a lot more shade going on, shade involved here. This bank here, when I first started botanizing the place 40 years ago, was just a riot of color. Wet prairie and fen species along the river's margin, sneezeweed, cardinal flower, purple fringe orchid. These have all been crowded out now. Here's another view. This is looking north across the river, 93, and then last week. And there's actually a single cottonwood at the northern limit of its range. I don't know if there's any further north in here. You can see it's still there. It's not doing very well, but it's encased by foliage here. So again, you've lost this nice sunny margin facing south. A lot of species have dropped out there. There's another before and after shot. This is the same view, sort of. This great big pine here fell over, and here's a shot taken last week. Not much of a riverbank there for forests to grow on. Another big surprise, vanishing present, unpleasant surprise, was the disappearance of 11 or 12 species of aquatic macrophytes in the river. I remember as a kid, it was wonderful. There were waving beds of Elodia and Vallisneria, 4 different potamogetons, lots of mussels in the river too. It was wonderful to look at these swaying beds of aquatics. And now they're all gone except for Vallisneria. You see that last week, there's nothing on the riverbed. This was a great big Elodia bed 40 years ago. Now it's gone. Why is it gone? Here's some of the plants that were there. And now they're all gone, except for the last one. It disappeared, and then in 1992 was the last time I noticed these things, and I didn't bother to look for 20 years. Could be rusty crayfish. They're now common in the river, and I understand they do chomp on aquatic vegetation. Or it could be just shade along the riverbanks. Paul Skowinski, aquatic guy in UW-Stevens Point, he said it could be either one, crayfish or the shade or a combination. And I remember as a kid too, with Wabash pigtoes, they were all over the riverbed. You could barely walk on them without stepping inside a clamshell, basically, in the 60s, and now they're all gone. Mudflats along the river, you can see a cardinal flower here, very rich flora, especially on low water years. We haven't had a low water year in the last 5 years. The river's been high all summer long, more rainfall. Sound familiar? Here are some of the riverbankers that I could not relocate in the last survey. Some grasses, other things too, along the mudflats. The mesic terraces, the west shelf here, the east shelf here, there's other ones too here, have a lot of rich, well-drained soils, but they're probably suffering from a lack of periodic flooding with more nutrients in there. So there are plants there that are winking out. There's only one cohosh left. There's only a few bellworts left on this rich mesic terrace. Oh, this is interesting too. This is on the west shelf. I used to have mountain maple, Acer spicatum, a northern species you probably know. And I also had twin flower west of the cabin in the pine woods. Both of these dropped out in the 80s or about 1990. And these are really plants that prefer cool northern woods. This is one where I think that you could argue that perhaps climate change has perhaps affected their disappearance. Plus, these have also dropped off my brother's property up near Lake Superior too. I'm curious in our trip to Pine Hollow whether we're going to find mountain maple there. I looked and it's supposed to be there. This is a 63 collection. Is it still at Pine Hollow? We'll find out on Saturday. Twin flower apparently is very rare in the driftless area. I think there's a record from La Crosse County. That's about it. This is another cool habitat on the property. This is a north-facing south riverbank. Very steep, but no bedrock here. And these clumps of polypodium fern, I saw small clumps in the 70s, and they've expanded to several meters in size over the last 40 years. This is also the habitat for bug-on-stick moss, which I haven't seen for a while, but I've got vouchers for it. And the dominant trees on the slope are going to be hemlock, yellow birch, and white cedar. And then there is a really cool fen, a seep, on this side of the river with abundant rough goldenrod, Solengal patula, there's Cardamine bulbosa, a springcrest, a bunch of fen species in there, but a lot of them are being shaded off. Another seep occurs right here, called Hawthorne Glen, and this had the only colony of sphagnum moss on the property, about 1 meter square, but that disappeared. I haven't seen it in 30 years. This one is mysterious. This is the golden Saxifrage, Chrysosplenia. I couldn't find that for several decades, now it's reappeared at the site. And then orchids. I have 15 of Wisconsin's 50 species of orchids on the property, 30% of the orchids, although at one time, not all 15. 12 were extant in the 70s, 10 at the last survey. Probably the rarest one is Hooker's orchid, which appeared in my Scotch pine plantation. I followed it for 4 years, sterile, flowered, and then disappeared. Special concern orchid. And some of the other orchids on the property, purple twayblade. This is John's picture of purple twayblade and Malaxis. And this one I saw in the 70s, and it was a disjunct record from further south. And now it's actually fairly common in third growth forest in the old fields south of the river. I'm told by Stephanie Lyon that it has a specific one species of fungus that it interacts with and no other. But it's actually moving north in Wisconsin. There are several records from Portage and Maritime counties now near Stevens Point. Very interesting mild purple flowers. And also this little guy, Malaxis unifolia. I found it in many spots in the 70s, and an eagle-eyed John found one plant flowering this summer. And I have it here for comparison to a leaf of Myanthum canadense. See how you could easily overlook this orchid if it was not a flower. Okay, and then this one I was looking for decades. Orchids invaded the Scotch pine plantation my father planted. In fact, 8 orchids invaded the plantation within 25 years of it being a hayfield. And I was expecting to find pink lady slipper because it invades red pine plantations throughout Wisconsin. Finally, 2008, it took 52 years after the plantation, and then I started to see it, and now it's actually fairly common in the plantation. And then I found a couple of new records just a couple weeks ago in August. I found the first, I apologize for the out of focus spot, I thought spotted coral first planted that. And then I relocated Casis ladystress, Spiranthes casei. So orchids haven't fared that badly compared to other plant groups. This is an interesting graph. I haven't talked about Cockamole spruces yet, but look at the difference here in plant groups that are associated with fungi very intimately. So orchids, many of them are microheterotrophs, they're parasitic on fungi, and then ericads like blueberries and lycopodiums, they have mycorrhizal associations with fungi. Look at the difference in these two tracks. Only 7 of these combined families at Cockamole spruces versus 34 at Butternut Pines. The size difference is not that big in the area. I think the difference here is soil type. This is heavy clay soils, poorly drained. Only 3 orchids here, 3 orthanthus. Here you have sandy loam, well drained, a lot of conifers. Okay, and then I want to talk a little bit about the areas south of the river, they were a hayfield at one point. These are pictures my father took in 1956, just before we planted the Scotch pines in here. It's going to grow Christmas trees. You're looking north toward the river. There's a great big red oak here in 56. You can see it in 38. And here's my picture from last week. It's 36 inches DDH. It's the largest plant on the largest tree on the property. So this is like ground zero. Nothing was here except the plowed field in 56. And I'll talk more about the Scotch pine plantation in a few slides. But first I want to just go about the south fields in general. All a hayfield, remember there's a field. Here's 1985, 2008 filling with jack pine, Scotch pine volunteering. And you can see how it's closed in. All fields, just a few fragments left. And then here's a picture toward the southwest corner of the, northeast corner of the tract, completely open in 83. And there are actually lanceolate violets, Caligula sanguinea, for Ted there, Carex bignellii was growing there. Those are all gone now. Because if you look at this same view right now, here's what it looked like last week. It's a thicket of young Scotch and jack pine and thickets of rubus in here. Very little grass or sedge left anymore. And then I'm going to quote by Hugh out there, if it can grow there, it can get there. He was a big proponent of long distance dispersal, rare random events, dispersing plants a long way, correct habitat. This is a picture in Ecuador, I did not take it, here's a cyga tree. And this is, I think, one of the most remarkable finds on the property John and I made last year. And that's in the site of an old hayfield, Mediola virginiana, Indian cucumber. We were wandering through this young forest of red maple and white birch and aspen and white pine. And we found this huge clone, several square meters, 150 stems, many in flower. We came back this year. This is a special concern species in Wisconsin. It's associated with beech, sugar maple. There aren't many records. I believe this might be the largest population in the state. Most you see a few stray plants here and there. What's cool about this, it's got a berry, so a bird must have brought this in. And the other thing is, Mediola. Another aspect of its remarkableness from being here. Anyway, that's an example of the invisible present too. You have pleasant surprises like this, as well as many unpleasant surprises when you resurvey. Okay, here's my survey intensity. When I was just learning plants, 75, 6, 7, I kind of have X'd out the days and the months I was there. Let's see, we go backwards here. Page up. Yeah, all right. How do I turn the light up? What did I do here? Okay. And so I spent a lot of time obviously looking. I was learning the plants at this time though. So if you look at what I did in the 70s, the blue bars by month, number of field days, versus what I did the last 3 years, it looks like I didn't spend any effort, but believe me, I was spending a lot of time learning these things in the field back in the 70s. And I think John, you can agree that we pretty well covered the place several times. We're not missing anything much here. We're pretty much at an asymptote for what we're finding in the last 2 years. So I published these results in 2004 in the Michigan Botanist, and the records include citations of herbarium specimens. So we vouchered these guys. We know what was there. And if we misidentified something, or if a species is going to be split into several other species, people can go to the herbarium upstairs and they can make the determinations and find out where to screw up. All right, and here's the last slide on general butternut pines. 16 hectares, 574 species over 42 years. Not all at one time. Right now there's only about 440 in the last 3 years, but 574. And here's compared with Madeline Island. It's almost 400 times the size, and yet we've only documented 534 species on Madeline Island. So it's a very diverse place. It's a mainland habitat, not an island. But yet if you really look carefully at a plot of land, you're going to find a lot of species, be it insects or plants. I want to mention briefly the Scotch pine plantation that my father planted in '56 for Christmas trees. About 5 acres. And I use that for my bio, how many have taken that right here? Botany 455. Grant Cotton was the professor back then, summer of '81. So I did a survey of that plantation. And what I did was I did 25 round quadrats, plots, not quadrats, round plots. Each was 0.01, 1/100th of a hectare, at a radius of 5.5 meters. I counted every species in every plot. Here's for the orchids, for example. You can see that about 40% of the plots have orchids in them. And then here is my data sheet I turned in to Dr. Cotton. 25 plots, occurrence, the commonest plants in here. I also tried to speculate on how they got in there, wind or birds. And then here's what the plantation to be looked like in '56 before the trees were planted. My father. 25 years after, this is actually an internet picture of Polytrichum, I don't have a picture, but 25 years later, this particular moss was dominant in the understory of Scotch pine. Scotch pine doesn't grow very well, and so there is not a really heavy fall of needle litter. It's very sparse on the ground, unlike a red pine plantation where you have this thick duff. So that thin litter leaves a lot of space for plants to colonize and grow under Scotch pines. I recommend, if you've got a Scotch pine plantation in your area, take a look at the understory. You might find some cool things in it. This is a picture of my plantation 60 years after establishment, taken a year or two ago, showing that club mosses have now dominated the understory, displacing the mosses. And also there's really cool things going on. There's a lot of hemlock regeneration under these pines, also on the other side of the river too. I don't understand this because deer are fairly common. I don't flush them very often. They're in the area, but I don't see very many deer. There's not enough to really affect hemlock regeneration. Good thing. You also see balsam fir regeneration, even these days. And then I did a resurvey of those plots, those 25.01 hectare plots in 2005, and also last year with John Floristic here. We went back. So I want to give you an example of some results of that survey. If you look at the average number of species in plots, remember that a plot is going to be about 33 feet in diameter, I think, roughly round. The number of species has gone down as succession has occurred in the Scotch pine plantation. And if you look at this, the annual rate of species loss versus drop-ins, species colonization, if you look at the, you see that there's been a lot of dropouts, and then there are, more recently, in the last decade, there's been more drop-in or colonization occurring within the plantation. Let's look at 3 different groups associated with fungi, see how they fared. If you look at club mosses in the plantation, look at this red line right down here. 2% frequency in the plots, jumped up to 31% by 2005, then dropped down to 19% last year, club mosses. So if you look at ericats, these little parallels, and Indian pipes and such, 14 to 36 to 27. Again, the peak is about 50 years in after the plantation. And then the orchids, I know this is hard to read, but it went from 8 orchids in the 70s and early 80s to 4 in 2005, and now there's just 2 extant in the plantation. So here's a comparison of those 3 groups associated with fungi again. You can see club mosses, orchids peaked about 25 years after the plantation was established and have been declining since. And club mosses and ericats peaked about 50 years after the plantation and somewhat declined since then. And then if you're into Floristic quality index, right, coefficient of conservatism, I tried to estimate that too. So here's the total number of species in the plantation, just not just in the plots. That's been going downhill. I estimate there were probably 50 in that old field. You took the mean coefficient of conservatism of those species. That's gone up rather evenly. And then finally, if you add these 2 together, you get Floristic quality index. You have to take stir and a number of species, but you add these 2 graphs together, you get this graph here, a little bit of an upward trend in Floristic quality index of the plantation. And then this is a comparison of species in the plots versus the entire plantation over those 3 survey periods. Okay, here's some takeaways. I think I mentioned them. Some Some groups peak 25 years after the establishment of the plantation, other ones 50. The FQI is slightly increased over that period of time, 36 years, and the coefficient of conservatism of native species has steadily increased, which you'd expect, really. All right, here's the second. I'm only going to have 10 slides on this one. This is my brother's property, Bayfield County. Heavy clay soils and boreal forest, although it's kind of weird because there's bur oak in the boreal forest. And here's Lake Superior here, and here's this property on the Iron River, about 5 miles inland. In fact, if you get a nice big storm in the lake in the fall, you can actually clear the lake 5 miles inland. And here's this property. It's a bowling alley or transect. It's only 20 acres, not 40. And it's a long, thin strip. Here's the 1939 air photo, and here's the 2015 air photo. The road goes through it. The house is here now. There was no house at that time. And here's the Iron River, which flows from north to south through the tract, the one end of the tract. Notice how dynamic the landscape is. Look at the shape of the river here. It's pretty well straight. This bend is about 130 degrees. Now look at it. Big curves, and this is like an 80-degree bend. Look at the difference in just 80 years. And look how the fields have filled in. But they haven't filled in as much as in Butternut Pines. Heavy clay soil. So here's the forest cover. If you remember one I had for Butternut Pines, you can see I started the survey when it had about 60% forest cover, and now it's up to about maybe 85% forest cover. Here is the house, here's the road. This is the most floristically diverse part of the property, a very steep east-facing slope with boreal forest on it. And then you get a river floodplain forest down here. So here's a few shots from 1993 showing great big emergent white pines, fir, spruce. Here's the Iron River. And then this is Rush Creek, a small creek inland. And this is now totally brushed in. There's no open space underneath these trees right now. 24 years later. And you've lost things like cattails and sump-stem bulrush that grew in the creek bed. Cattails have gone away, a good thing, at both places, Butternut and Cowden. No more cattails. And here's the survey 93, blue rather, and then 2015 to 17 resurvey. Okay, here's the results, Michigan botanist, and here's another Apostle Island for comparison. This one is 411 species, Stockton has 429, so comparable even though the size difference is 500 times the size. Okay, now let's get to look at a bunch of graphs here, compare the flora and changes in the flora between these two tracts and between the two times. So some of you may remember Miguel Chazaro. Remember Miguel Chazaro, anyone? Way back when? There he is in the canoe with my brother. Butternut Pines back in '84. So here is native versus non-native in the tracks at Butternut and Calcamo. And you can see that, let's see here, between 70s and 40 years later, the number of species has gone down. Now I'll talk more about that. Pretty significantly in Butternut Pines, lost species. Calcamo spruces about the same, not much of a loss. I should mention, if you're talking about size, Butternut is twice as big as Calcamo. If you look at species area curves, the exponent Z, about 0.16 for the Midwest. So you should expect about 15% more species if you double the size. So if you want to add 15% to these graphs, you can get a comparable richness comparison. Native species, you can see again, pretty close to even Calcamo spruces, significant decline in Butternut Pines. Here's a running graph I have when I'm in the field. This shows, this column is 1970s abundance. This is 2015 abundance. And I have 6 categories of abundance. Abundance, 6 points, rare, 1 point, absent, 0. And then I also color-coded this to show if things have been increasing or declining. So green means the species has either increased or newly colonized the site. Yellow means it's dropped down a step in abundance, say from abundant to common. Orange means it's dropped down at least 2 steps, let's say from abundant to common to fairly common, and red means it's dropped out entirely, it's gone. So these are the ferns, and they're stable or increasing in butternut pines. They fared pretty well. The only one that's completely gone is the adder's tongue fern, which appeared there for a couple of years. And the batrachiums have decreased, and I know they're affected by exotic earthworms, which are there. But here's a group, sedges at butternut pines, that have really taken a hit. Many are dropped out entirely, carex species. A few have colonized, and then others are declining. So sedges have definitely taken a hit. You're going to see a graph showing that. Here is, I tried to measure what's happening there in various ways, not just numbers of species, but the aggregate, the sum, all the coefficients of conservatism of native species. Here you get a slight decline at Caucomos, which is perhaps certainly a significant decline at butternut pines. Floristic quality index for the entire tract. Again, the same pattern, slight decrease here at Caucomos, maybe not significant. Butternut pines probably statistically significant. And then if you look at aggregate abundance of native species, in other words, if you take the numbers I assigned in the 70s and present day, these abundance, sum all those numbers up for all native species, you can see the same pattern emerging. Okay, and then I looked at losers, stable, and winners among those native species at both sites. And you can see here, dropouts, they're gone completely. Decreasers stayed the same. Increasers, drop-ins, new colonizers. You can see things are really happening at butternut pines. A lot of them have decreased. Many have dropped out. And yet, there is some increase occurring too. Whereas at Caucomos spruces, much more stability in the flora up in northwestern Wisconsin. I kind of lump those end categories to make it a little simpler. So here are the dropouts and decreasers, stable, and winners, and increases. You can see here, butternut pines, a lot more dropping out or decreasing, but also a little bit more increase too. And then there's also what I call soon-to-be-goners. These are plants that are once were fairly common, occasional, maybe uncommon, and now they're rare. They're represented by 1, 2, or 3 individuals. They appear to be outcompeted and shaded out. And I think of these 30 species here, I think most will be gone within 5 years, the great majority within 10 years. That should be cauliflowers. So let's look at a couple of plant groups. Sedges, as I mentioned, have really taken a hit. They're stable, or even slightly, perhaps higher at Caucomos spruces, but they've really taken a big hit at butternut pines. For example, Carex castania now gone. There are many other sedges that are gone at butternut pines. Prairie species, and as I mentioned before, I don't know where these came from, because this was a beech hemlock forest, and I didn't plant these guys there. They got in either by farming or maybe tree planting. They declined from 31 down to 14 prairie or barren species. So these 2 milkweeds, for example, have dropped out at butternut pines. And then other plant groups, Asteraceae, as you might expect, since there are fewer fields and less prairie, asters have declined at butternut pines. I think it's the biggest family there. I think it's 55 or 58 species of butternut pines. And then I looked at a map of, I looked at floristic affinities of the winners and losers. Are they southern, northern, or widespread Wisconsin species? So if we look at, just at butternut pines, so if we look at the dropouts, decreasers, the losers, you can see many widespread species throughout Wisconsin have declined or dropped out. Northern ones have taken a bit more of a hit than southern species, although I don't know if this is significant or not statistically. And then winners, I tried to put this on the same scale. There aren't many winners. And I think if I go here, you can see I've expanded those graphs for the winners. Again, there are a few more southern species that have come in and won as opposed to northern species, green dragon, for example. So here are mutual dropouts. These are losers at both sites. They include mountain maple, you can see at Pine Hollow, twinflower gone, a couple of sedges, and a couple of plants of actually old fields like sundrops and columbine. And then these wetland plants have dropped out. Okay, and then these are some of the increasers over 40 years. And I tried to figure out why they may be increasing. Perhaps peer dispersal in some of these. Some of these grasses, like Brachyletrum and another Leerzia, they cling to deer. They have very sharp spikelets. Other ones are perhaps not unpalatable and benefit from shade, like the holly or unpalatable bloodroot. They've increased. There are rare species too at both sites. Some only appear for a few years. And I'll just throw these on you. I could talk about these a long time, but I'm not going to. But there are rare species at both sites. And I also looked at exotics too. I looked at the number of exotic species, and here this is unusual. Kokomo spruces, the number of exotics has increased slightly, and I think that's a real increase. The reason is that my brother lives there, so there's actually a garden, there's a sump pump, a new holding tank put in, there's clearance along the road around the building, so it's not surprising that there are more exotics. Butternut pines have basically let alone for 40 years. Nothing's been done. And you can see that the aggregate abundance of exotics and the number of exotic species has gone down significantly, along with the native flora. Threatening invasives, Kokomo spruces, my brother's property, reed canary grass and crown vetch are really coming in along the roads and old fields and along the riverbank. Those are pretty bad. Smooth brones come in too. At my place, there's some riverbank species, forget-me-not and yellow flag iris, and also Linistra bella is becoming more common. It's still not common. There's about a dozen moderately sized plants. I try to cut them and poison them whatever I can. And then the buckthorn seed rain has begun at Butternut Pines. It took a long time, but I found tiny seedlings of glossy starting in 2012, and my first seedlings right in the middle of the tract here of common buckthorn, a few. I'm guessing that they probably came from the backyard of one of these houses or cabins, which must have a buckthorn somewhere around it, but seed rain has begun on buckthorns. And then these are not a threat at either site, fortunately. No garlic mustard, no spotted knapweed. Okay, and this is kind of the payoff graph for the talk here. If you're looking at, if you percent annual increase or decrease for these guys at both sites, you can see the number of natives. Butternut Pines is losing about 0.5% per year. So there's 400 natives. It's losing about 2 species per year. Aggregate coefficient of conservatism, about equal loss at both sides. Aggregate abundance, butternut pine, more loss once again. FQI, the entire tract is declining, even though there's no logging, and even though it's getting more forested, it's declining. Aggregate abundance of carex is crashing at butternut pines. Maybe stable or slightly increasing at Kokomo spruces. And then weed load, aggregate abundance of exotics, is going way down at butternut pines, and it's going up at Kokomo spruces. So here we can speculate. This is my best hand-waving guess as to the factors that are causing these reasons for decline. Next slide will have reasons for increase. So I think forest recovery, increased shade, is the major factor causing a decline in diversity at butternut pines. Not so much at Kokomo spruces. Climate warming is certainly, I think, a leading suspect for some of these northern species like mountain maple, flintflower, and sphagnum moss. I used to get Sorbus mountain ash seedlings at butternut pines scattered around the property. I don't see them anymore. That's because I think the mature trees in the vicinity are gone. Invasive crayfish, declining pollinators, big question mark here. I have no way to quantify that. Forest fragmentation, again, hard to quantify that. Deer bird burberry has certainly affected the lilies in the old sense. In both places, exotic earthworm damage, plant pathogens, element butternut, hydrologic disruption, a dam upstream. Actually, there's a dam upstream in both places. But I think competition with invasive plants is not has no effect so far. And then increases. Why are some increasing? Again, forest recovery may result in a more mature mycoflora, fungal fauna in the flora in the soil, and that may assist things like club mosses and orchids. Deer abundance, they may spread things like certainly enchanter's nightshade, burr-like fruits. Hakelia has come in and increased burr-like fruits, and grasses that are clinging spikelets. And in climate warming may have helped some southern species come in, like Carex grisea, Carex hertifolia, Carex blanda Our poke milkweed first appeared last year. So takeaways on 40 years of survey work. I was amazed how dynamic these floras were. I mean, you expect, if you're an ecologist, a 1 meter square quadrat, or even one on the size of half this room, there's going to be a changeover in species in 10 years. But these are giant quadrats, and yet there's an immense amount of change going on in a 40-acre quadrat or 20-acre quadrat. And I want to throw this to you. I mean, some of you guys are in your early 20s and gals in your early 20s. Go out there, find a place that you can monitor for 40 years. And if we had 50 or 100 of these sites around the state at this scale, it would be pretty wonderful. I'm hoping that John Zaborski can carry on. I'll probably put this, sell this place and put it under a conservation easement at some point. I'm hoping he can go back in 30 years and get extended data of 70 years for this location. And it really does appear, intermediate disturbance hypothesis. It looked to me as if this curve of the forest recovery, the inflection point on that curve, the steepest point on that curve, seems to be the richest for the flora of butternut pines and perhaps also for cowpole spruces. Too shady right now. So here again, here's when I started surveying. At this point in the curve, here's now. And cowpole spruce is the same way. Surveys have started at this point. All right. So I would say that cowpole spruces, it appears to be pretty stable, the flora, over 24 years. But butternut pines, it's certainly gone down. I think maybe the heavy clay soils impede the forest recovery. Okay, and I think more species are going to drop out of butternut pines in the next couple of years. All right, here's some other takeaways. Exotic plants really don't have an effect yet. Climate warming has limited some species. Aquatic plants and sedges are vulnerable for whatever reasons. And then, I guess we talked about this Floristic crash. I think the way the rivers run on both tracks makes a difference. In the O'Connell, butternut pines, the river runs from west to east, and cowpole spruces runs from south to north. The orientation, east-west versus north-south, makes a difference. East-west means if you get tall trees on both banks, shade is complete. If you have a north-south running river, you get some sun on both banks. It's not quite as shady. So that's my hand-waving guess anyway. Also, is there a fragmentation effect of butternut pines of all these new residences and cabins in the area? Also, there's been a resurgence of agriculture of butternut pines in the area. It was abandoned farms. Now they're going back in. They're growing soybeans and corn with the attendant herbicides and pesticides. Okay, and I think these are really cool slides here. I have no data on these, but only my own memory from 50, 60 years about how this land has changed with regard to animals, not just plants. Moths, I can't believe when I was a kid, you would put the porch light on and the screen would be covered with hundreds of moths of all sizes and shapes. The diversity was incredible. That's gone now. That's gone. There are a lot more whippoorwills back then, I think, because they fed on the moths. Butterflies, they would huddle in the driveway. Many, many butterflies. Bees, too. Leopard frogs, they were so common you would walk a step, a couple of frogs would jump another step, another frog, all along the river. You guys have never seen this stuff. Wabash pigtoes, mussels in the river. Bull snakes, I think people kill them because they hiss at you, they're rather threatening looking. Dragonflies and water striders are abundant on the river. Bats, of course, white nose syndrome. Wood turtles are much common. And then the open area birds, indigo bunnies and field sparrows have disappeared. And then there were actually open mammals, open areas like badgers, skunks, and jumping mice, all gone. And what have we gained? Deer, turkeys, and I think they have a very deleterious impact. They're like pigs of the woods, flying pigs of the woods. They scrabble up the soil, really turn up everything. They're very abundant now in just the last 20 years. Wolves are in the area. Sandhill cranes are now common. Cardinals too, and affiliated woodpeckers. I was a big bird watcher as a kid, did not see affiliated woodpecker at that place until the 1980s. Trees just weren't big enough.
That's the trees.
So last two slides, I want to thank my family, my brother, niece, mother, father for buying this wonderful place, and also Hugh Iltis for nourishing my interest in the natural world. And that's it. Thank you. I probably run over any questions. Yep. I see two of his sons here. Thank you, Mike and Frank, for attending. Yes.
So one of the more interesting things, so admittedly we only have a sort of a 2-point comparison, was that Butternut Pines had both higher extinction rates and higher immigration rates.
Yes.
And I guess I would suggest as an important contributing factor that you didn't really emphasize the difference in effective soil fertility. The heavy clay soils are potentially quite rich in nutrients, but because of poor drainage, would tend to have only, and also mechanical impedance, would tend to have a shallow rooting zone, and that would slow down rates of growth and hence competitive exclusion, and at the same time would be inimical to invasion. Whereas on the effectively richer soils,
Sandy loam, basically.
you would have much higher rates of growth, higher rates of competitive exclusion, but also more favorable conditions for many plants to get established.
Yeah, I know soil, I thought, makes a big difference. There are 8 species of club moss at Butternut Pines, none at Hawthorne spruces. Yeah.
Are you going to kill off those single seedlings of
Oh yeah, I do.
Rapis? You need the herbarium specimens.
I killed them and they're on her queue right now. What else? Oh yeah, also the names of the tracks. I picked these names when I first started. I had to pick a name. I didn't want, we have our own nicknames, the ranch and the cabin. So I picked out most spruces, and all the big spruces are gone. They fell over. They're small ones. And butternut pines, of course, butternuts are gone. I don't have a picture, but the cabin at Butternut Pines was surrounded by white pines. I didn't take the picture that I lived this week. It's now red oak. Red oak is displacing white pine around the cabin. Yes?
It seems that earthworms might have something to do with some of the declines
Yeah.
of butternut. Do you have a sense of
I don't have a sense of
when
how
they might
many.
have gotten in?
No, I haven't done the test. I don't know.
Okay,
Shame on
and
me.
then deer abundance as well. You should be able to get data from the DNR.
Yeah.
I'm sure they did deer counts, back at, that time.
But
as well.
isn't deer are so local where they,
Yeah.
it just doesn't seem like, I don't flush many deer at Butternut Pines. And the regeneration of hemlock and balsam are doing well. And the lilies are doing okay, not great. Another question over here? Don.
This is great work, and I really like your encouragement for younger people to replicate it. Are you aware of any other studies like yours?
I don't know, are there any other microfloras like this in Wisconsin or the Midwest at this scale, 2040? I mean, I'm sure there's a list for the Wisconsin Arboretum, but that's not quite the same.
And could you walk the Apostle Islands again and match the one?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure, like for Stockton and Madeline Islands, I didn't reach an asymptote for those totals. There's probably more species there. Yeah, how much coverage do I have? I think I'm probably 90% covered, species covered in the resurvey. Wouldn't you agree with that, John? Having gone there several times, several years, at all times of the year with John. I think we've got
At these
95%.
two sites here, you only,
Yeah.
I think that's a conservative estimate. I think you probably got most, but
Maybe, yeah.
in many ways, your results parallel what we found in the long-term Curtis revisit sites in
Yeah.
terms of overall shifts of diversity and the relatively high amount of turnover that's going on in the particular groups that are phasing out. I would really like your assignment of probable causes.
Yeah.
I think that's probably spot on. It agrees with my experience anyway. Where are you planning to publish these?
Michigan Bounds probably,
Okay.
again.
Yeah.
I do welcome other places too.
And would you be willing to put your slides here up on our plant ecology library?
Sure, I think someone's taking it from YouTube, you can put those on. I can give you the slides too if
Great.
you like. Yeah.
We probably ought to wrap it up, but thank you for our